The sky over the valley had not been blue in 3 years. It was always gray with smoke, or orange with fire, or black with night and fear. The land between the Ashridge pack and the Blackthorn pack had once been full of wheat fields and quiet rivers. Now it was full of broken fences, burned barns, and wolves who flinched at every sound. Elina Marsh had stopped counting the days since the war began. She had stopped counting a lot of things. She no longer counted how many hours she had slept, or how many times she had run out of clean bandages, or how many young wolves she had carried away from the fighting, too late to save. She only counted the ones who lived. That number, at least, gave her a reason to keep working. She knelt now beside a young fighter named Tobin, pressing a cloth against a wound on his arm. Around her, the camp was quiet, in the way that camps are quiet after a long night of fear. Not peaceful, just tired. Smoke drifted low over the tents. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled once, then stopped, as if even grief had grown too heavy to finish. "You're going to be fine," Elina said to Tobin, though she was not sure it was true. She said it anyway, because the words mattered more than the certainty behind them. Tobin's eyes were half closed. "Is it over yet?" Elina did not answer. It was the question everyone asked, and she had never once been able to say yes. The war had started over land. At least, that was what the elders said. 3 years ago, the Blackthorn pack claimed that a strip of border territory near the river had always belonged to them, not to Ashridge. Alpha Calix of Blackthorn said his grandfather had signed a treaty proving it. No one had ever seen this treaty. No one ever would. But Calix was strong, and his pack was hungry for more land. And soon there were raids in the night, and then there were losses on both sides, and then there was no way to stop without one side losing everything. Alpha Dreven, the leader of Ashridge, was not a cruel man. He simply did not know how to lose. Every time Blackthorn pushed forward, Dreven pushed back, and every time he pushed back, more young wolves did not come home. He had grown thin and gray over the past year, like a candle burning down to nothing. Elina had joined the healers' tents 2 years ago, when her own brother went missing in a raid and was never found. She told herself she stayed to help others. The truth, which she rarely admitted, was that helping others was the only thing that kept her from breaking. That morning, as she finished tying the bandage on Tobin's arm, a strange silence fell over the camp. It was not the tired silence of exhaustion. It was a different kind, sharp, sudden, the kind that makes the hair on your arms rise before you understand why. Elina stood and looked toward the ridge above the valley. A single rider had appeared at the top of the hill. He carried no banner. No soldiers rode beside him, except for one man a few steps behind, who also seemed to carry no weapon raised, no warning shouted. Just 2 riders, calm as a quiet afternoon, looking down at a battlefield that had not known calm in years. Word passed through the camp like wind through dry grass. The king, the Alpha King, has come. Elina had heard of him the way everyone had heard of him, in stories told around fires, half believed and half feared. King Kade Voss ruled the Frosthollow territory far to the north, a land so strong that no pack had ever dared raise a hand against it. They said he had not spoken a single word in public for 9 years. They said his silence was more frightening than any other king's shouted threats, because no one knew what he was thinking until it was already done. Some said his silence began the day his mate died. Others said he had simply grown tired of words that solved nothing. No one really knew, because he never explained himself, and no one was brave enough to ask twice. Dreven came stumbling out of his tent, hastily pulling on his coat, his face pale. Across the field, Elina could see Calix doing the same, surrounded by his own startled guards. Kade rode down the hill slowly. He did not hurry. He did not need to. Every wolf in the valley, friend and enemy alike, had already stopped moving, as if some old instinct buried deep in their blood recognized him before their minds did. He stopped his horse at the very center of the battlefield, halfway between the 2 camps, and dismounted without a sound. The man behind him, who Elina would later learn was called Roran, the king's beta, dismounted as well, and stood a respectful step back. For a long moment, Kade simply looked around. He looked at the burned fields. He looked at the broken fences. He looked at the rows of wounded lying in the healers' tents, and at Tobin's bandaged arm. and at Elina standing frozen with a strip of cloth still in her hands. He said nothing. Drevin was the first to find his voice, though it came out shaking. "Your Majesty, we did not know you were coming." Kade did not answer him either. He simply turned his head toward Calix, who stood across the field with his guards bunched tightly around him, as if numbers alone could offer protection. The two men looked at each other. Kade did not raise his voice. He did not raise a hand. He simply held Calix's gaze, steady and unblinking, for 3 long seconds. Something happened in that silence that Elina would never fully be able to explain, not even years later when she tried to tell the story to her own children. It was as if the air itself grew heavier. Calix's guards, one by one, began to lower their eyes. Calix himself took an unsteady step backward, his proud shoulders curving inward, though no blow had been thrown and no words had been spoken. It was not magic, not exactly. It was something older than magic. The deep, instinctive pull that runs through every wolf, toward whoever stands strongest among them. And in that valley, on that morning, every wolf's instinct agreed on the same answer. Calix's knees buckled, and he sank down, kneeling in the mud without seeming to decide to do it. Roran stepped forward then, speaking in a clear, steady voice, since everyone in the kingdom understood that when the beta spoke, he spoke the king's own thoughts. 3 weeks ago, Roran said, word reached the Frosthollow territory of a treaty supposedly proving Blackthorn's claim to this land. The king sent for the original record kept in the old border archive. There is no such treaty, there never was. This war was built on a lie, invented to win land and to win mating rights over Ashridge's strongest bloodlines. A murmur ran through both camps. Drevin's face went through shock, then disbelief, then something close to fury, though even his fury seemed to fade quickly under the weight of grief for everything already lost. Calix tried to rise, tried to argue. This is not proof of anything. A missing record does not. Kade took one single step forward. That was all. One step. Calix's words died in his throat. He did not try to speak again. It was, Elina thought, the strangest thing she had ever witnessed. An entire war, 3 years of fire and loss and broken families, ended not with a sword, not with a battle, not even with a sentence, but with one man's silence and one slow step across a muddy field. Roran continued speaking on the king's behalf, his tone calm but final. Nix was stripped of his title that very hour. His own beta, a quiet wolf named Ferris who had clearly grown tired of fighting a war he never believed in, stepped forward and accepted the burden of leadership without hesitation, already speaking softly to Calix's stunned guards about laying down arms and beginning the long walk home. Drevin, still pale, dropped to one knee before Kade in gratitude, his voice thick. "Your Majesty, I do not know how to thank you. Whatever the Northern Throne wishes of Ashridge, it is yours." Kade looked at him for a moment, then he shook his head, a small, simple gesture, but one that Roran would later describe to Elina as the first thing approaching refusal that anyone in the king's court had seen from him in years. He wanted nothing. He had not come for thanks. He had come, it seemed, simply because the lie had reached far enough, and the dying had gone on long enough, and somewhere in his long silence, he had decided that some wrongs were worth crossing a kingdom to undo, even without a single word of explanation. While the two camps slowly began to stir, wolves rising from where they had knelt, voices rising in confusion and relief and disbelief all at once, Elina found herself walking forward before she had fully decided to do it. She was not afraid of him. She realized this with some surprise, even as she crossed the muddy ground toward the most feared king in the northern lands. She had spent 3 years afraid of bigger things than legends, afraid of losing patience, afraid of losing her brother, afraid of a war that never seemed to end. A silent king standing in a muddy field did not frighten her. If anything, the unfairness of his timing made her angry. "Where were you 3 years ago?" she asked, stopping in front of him, her voice rough with exhaustion and grief she had never let herself fully release. "When this all started, you could have stopped it then. You could have saved hundreds of lives. Where were you?" Roran went very still beside the king, clearly bracing for some response. No one spoke to the king this way. No one dared. But Kade did not look angry. He looked at her the way a man looks at something unexpected, something he had not seen in a very long time and had almost forgotten how to recognize. His eyes, which Elina had expected to be cold, were instead simply tired, the way her own eyes felt after every long night with the wounded. He did not answer her question. He never answered anyone's questions in words, but he did not look away from her either, and the silence between them felt different from the silence he had used against Calyx. That silence had been a wall. This one felt almost like a door, slightly open, waiting to see if she would step through it. "You don't talk," she said, less an accusation now and more an observation. "Everyone says you haven't spoken a word in 9 years." Beside them, Roran cleared his throat carefully, as if deciding whether to explain on the king's behalf, the way he always did. But Kade lifted one hand slightly, a small gesture, and Roran fell silent, understanding that this time, the king wished to be the one not quite speaking for himself. Elina studied him for a long moment, this silent king who had just ended a war with nothing but a look and a step forward. She did not know yet why he had stopped speaking, or what grief or weight sat behind his quiet eyes. She only knew that whatever it was, it had not stopped him from coming. "Thank you," she said finally, softer now, "for coming, even if it was late." Something shifted very slightly at the corner of Kade's mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. The kind of expression that suggested smiling itself was a skill he had not practiced in a long time. Then he gave her one small nod, turned, and walked back toward his horse. Roran lingered a moment longer, studying Elina with open curiosity. "You're the first person in years who's spoken to him like that," he said quietly. "Most people are too frightened." "I've buried too many people to be frightened of a man who came here to stop the burying," Elina said. Roran almost smiled at that. Fair enough. He nodded toward her once, respectfully, and followed his king back up the hill. In the days that followed, the war ended properly. Not with celebration, exactly, since too much had been lost for anyone to feel like celebrating, but with the quieter relief of soldiers laying down their weapons and farmers beginning, cautiously, to walk back toward their burned fields to see what could be rebuilt. Ferris, now leading what remained of the Blackthorn pack, sent word that he wished to begin proper peace talks with Ashridge, this time with honest maps and honest history, not invented treaties. Drevin, slowly recovering some of the color in his face, spent his days helping rebuild rather than commanding troops, something Elina suspected suited him far better than war ever had. And in the healers' tents, Elina kept working, because there were still wounds to tend, even in peace. But the work felt different now. Each bandage she tied felt less like delaying an ending and more like building toward a beginning. Weeks passed. The fields began to show the first green shoots of new wheat. The fences, slowly, were repaired. One quiet morning, as Elina walked along the border road with a basket of supplies, she saw a single rider approaching from the north. No banner, no guards riding beside him. Just one horse, moving at an easy pace, exactly as it had on that first strange morning. She stopped walking and crossed her arms, more out of habit than real annoyance, though there was a flicker of something close to a smile tugging at her mouth despite herself. "You could have sent a letter," she called out as he drew near, "instead of riding all this way again." Kade dismounted, looping his horse's reins loosely over a fence post. He did not answer her, of course. He never did, not in words, but he walked toward her with the same unhurried calm he'd carried across the battlefield weeks before, and when he stopped in front of her, he simply held out a small folded cloth he had been carrying. She unfolded it carefully. Inside was a single pressed wildflower, the kind that grew only in the northern Frosthollow hills, far from where she stood. Elina looked up at him, surprised into silence of her own, for the first time in longer than she could remember. Kade still said nothing. He did not need to. Whatever words he had given up 9 years ago, he had clearly found another way to speak, quietly, carefully, one small gesture at a time, to the one person who had never been afraid to ask him questions he could not answer. And for the first time in 3 long years, the valley around them was simply, peacefully quiet. Not the heavy silence of fear, but the soft, ordinary silence of a place finally allowed to rest.